Injection molded parts perform well when they're given the right amount of time to flow. So like a liquid plastic flows into a mold, and then that part solidifies. If you have non-uniform wall thicknesses, then things happen to the geometry as it cools. If you have a big mass of plastic behind an outer surface, that mass will cool slower than the rest of the thinner parts. And when it cools slower, it can sink. So you'll literally have sinks in the part. Even though the part on CAD looks beautiful, by the time it comes out of an injection molding machine, if you haven't considered some of uniform wall thickness, for example, or how that part is going to release from the mold, it can cause defects with the parts in manufacturing. And they might not even be functional defects, they may just be cosmetic defects. Another one is where you have a part with a hole in it, and when plastic flows around that hole, it has to come around that hole and then it meets up, and that's called a knit line. And that knit line is visible in your part. There's ways to design out those knit lines, and there's ways for plastic to come in at different points. Sometimes it can be a real art in manufacturing to find the right place to inject the plastic so it cools at the right rate. And of course there's simulations for all of these things, but in the end the rubber really hits the road, or plastic hits the tool, I guess, when you actually have the first shot parts coming out. And then the process of manufacturing can be a process of troubleshooting some of those issues as well. And a lot of processes are constantly changing and evolving. As an example, design for additive manufacturing. Additive manufacturing has been around for a very long time, but to use it at scale in manufacturing, where you're taking those parts and actually giving them to customers, still relatively new. You know, with injection molding, you have to buy the tool, and you have to make the tool. The tool can take 30, 60, 90 days to make and be very expensive. So if you can make that same part successfully on an additive machine, it's a very different proposition. So being on top of all of these different manufacturing techniques as they evolve can help guide the right decision that's the best for the product and the best for the customer, and the thing that's going to be successful quickly in the marketplace. Most circuit boards today are populated with a blank board that goes in a frame, and then surface mount, they're called surface mount components, are populated by machine on top of that. If you have some parts which have mechanical requirements, for example, like a switch, you have a push button that is always getting pushed. If your design doesn't incorporate the proper mechanical elements to support that switch, although on CAD it looks fine, you know, the button's where it needs to be, and there's a piece of plastic that presents as a button on the external and hits that push button. Once it's off the computer and into either a prototype or manufactured product, pushing that button 10,000 times, you may find that circuit board breaks. Understanding what type of switch is going to be successful in that position, or understanding that, you know, it working 100 times is not the same as it working 10,000 times, and making sure that you're doing that testing. Those are some of the things that are important to catch as early as you can, and very difficult to simulate and very difficult to even understand how prototype parts versus production parts are going to work. Fortunately, prototype parts are usually lousier than the final manufactured parts. So if you design something that fails in prototype, it will likely fail in production. Sometimes things that fail in prototype will be fine in production. So understanding the difference between those things can be an important part of the process too. Large plastic parts, in prototype, they're usually CNC'd or 3D printed. Especially if they're CNC'd, the parts themselves are quite stable, like they're dimensionally stable. And then you go and injection mold them, and when they get released, they're not stable at all. If they need to be held in place while they're cooling, or like there's residual stresses that occur that can change the shape of the final product. If you're aware of that, you can design in features that hold the whole thing together, like the other parts of the design pull these deforming parts into conformance. So if you know and can anticipate that you may have issues with deformation of the finished parts, then you can design in the features that will pull them back into shape. Common mistakes that teams make in design for manufacturing is thinking they're designing for manufacturing, but they're actually designing for something else. Most people design for themselves, whether they're doing it consciously or subconsciously. When a design is not yet complete, the important thing for the product is to be able to test it, for example. So you know how you're doing, especially with something that's really complex, like a large, complex electromechanical device that includes software to control it. Knowing what your sensors are doing at all times and being able to switch those sensors out, being able to debug it, having test points, all of those things are going to make the design process faster. But none of them are needed once the design's done, or most of them are not needed when the design is not done. So I think the challenging part is to think of, okay, well, yes, this is produced to be assembled successfully and tested successfully, but ultimately you need to refocus that on the person that's going to be experiencing the products outside of the manufacturing field. So your customer, your stakeholder, the purchaser, the end user, the patient, and taking out some of those things that might be expensive. So, a screw and a brass fitting in an injection molded post, that's two different parts that are not needed. And, the process of screwing it in are not needed. That can be replaced with a snap fastener. If you put that at the beginning, like at that phase 3, if you have that snap fastener there, the snap fastener in a prototype part will often break. And so doing that doing that design for manufacturing process can also be sort of like refocusing who you're doing this for activity. Otherwise, you're going to have those screws and those fasteners on the injection molding line, and the person who's putting the injection mold together is going to have to hand place those fasteners into the mold before it activates. And then on the assembly line, someone is going to have a screwdriver and screws and putting those screws in, whereas both those things might be able to be avoided in prototype. But phase 3, that's the wrong call. In production design, it's the right call. Another common issue has to do with compliance. So it doesn't have anything to do with the parts themselves. Let's say you have a medical device that has functionally passed everything, but it goes for testing for emissions too late, like EMC, electromagnetic compliance. If you've gone through and tooled your parts and you've completed your software and you can't change anything at this point because it's too expensive, and then you find out you failed EMC, then you need to band-aid stuff on top of it, which we see all the time, right? Shielding inside your enclosure rather than designing a circuit board that doesn't emit radiation in the first place. Or you need to put ferrite beads on long cables where you may have avoided the need for having a long cable in the first place. In prototype, hooking things up with cables is really easy to do because you're only making one cable harness. When you make 1,000 of them, making 1,000 cable harnesses is a real pain in the neck. And then if you find out then that cable harness is the thing that is making you fail EMI, that's an expensive time to change it. So that design for manufacturing and design for assembly can also be like design for compliance. And it's a time-consuming thing to do, and it requires a lot of engineering and technical skill, but it's so much worth it if you can avoid those problems too late. If you don't do a good job at the production design phase and anticipating how something is going to survive through its life cycle, and if you haven't done that proper testing too, the most expensive thing is to release a product that will then fail at some point in the future with the customer. And that can be devastating to a company.